Foreign ministers of the 32 NATO countries are holding their last meeting of the year this week, with Ukraine now insisting that NATO membership could help end the hot phase with Russia. Let's turn to Dr. Ronald Suny for more. Hello there, Dr. Suny.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm in good shape.
Let's start with what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskky is insisting. He's saying the membership would allow him to negotiate a ceasefire deal with Russia. Now, isn't this the first time that Zelensky has mentioned the possibility of a ceasefire?
In the past, Zelensky has talked about, ending the war, but with no concessions of territory whatsoever to the Russians. That is, they even claim they want Crimea back, which Russians have held since 2014. But now, Zelensky is saying that he could see making concessions. He's being very careful. That is, they could stop the war now where the armies are standing, because recently the Russians have been advancing. Ukrainians are running out of manpower. So this is very important that finally they bring this thing to an end. And then later, Zelensky says, we can decide diplomatically about whether there would be concessions made about the land. So he says, let's stop the hot war now. We can talk about concessions later. This is new.
But I'm sure NATO itself is in a very challenging, position. What kind of stance will NATO take with just 1 month left until the Biden administration in the U.S. ends its term?
First of all, the Russian government has made it clear that it will not tolerate NATO membership.
Right.
Ukraine can go into the European Union, but not NATO membership. The Trump-Vance government, according to Vance's statements in September, were that the land concessions would be made to the Russians, but Ukraine would remain neutral, not in NATO. Zelensky, on the other hand, in this latest statement, is saying, okay, we can have a ceasefire, but NATO must guarantee the unoccupied parts of Ukraine remain under NATO protection. So you see, it's a very delicate negotiation. And everyone is waiting for the Trump administration to take power. We have a very strange situation here in the United States. We have a kind of interregnum, or better to say, we have what Russians once called dual power. There are two governments.
Right.
There's the actual government that's ruling, Biden, and then there's the anticipated Trump government, which is putting people into positions of power who are pushing for this new ceasefire and concessions to Russia.
Dr. Suny, then let's talk about the incoming Trump administration. Like you mentioned, Trump's Ukraine envoy pick is Keith Kellog. Now, he's been all about ending the war. What kind of deal do you think the Trump administration and, Kellogg will offer Ukraine instead of giving Ukraine the NATO membership that it's been, eager to get?
General Kellogg was a critic and is still a critic of the Biden administration. They went too slow. They didn't do enough. We should fight this war. And now, as he's moved toward the Trump administration, he's accepted the Trump position that there ought to be a ceasefire, that the war should come to an end. And it's clear that Trump, for all of his faults and all of his ways of acting, in fact, wants to bring these wars to an end. And he's ready to make concessions to Russia in order to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. He doesn't seem to like wars, foreign wars that the United States is wasting its money and manpower in, mostly money, of course. And he's also planning in some odd way to bring the war in Gaza also to an end. But there he's going to make major concessions through his Christian Zionist appointments, like the new ambassador to Israel. That will, in fact, basically end any Palestinian dreams of statehood.
I see. Well, let's talk about other partners getting involved in the Ukraine crisis, not just Russia, but also North Korea, having already transferred over, reportedly, 100 artillery systems. The question is, will these systems actually play a big role in taking down the Russian forces?
So Russia, like Ukraine, has suffered from a manpower shortage. The Ukrainians have no one but Ukrainians to fight their wars. Americans fight wars by supplying arms and intelligence, but no manpower.
Right.
We fight other people's bodies. But Russia has solved its manpower problem. First of all, Putin doesn't want to have a mobilization of Russians because there's opposition to that. People flee abroad, etc. And so how did they solve it? They're having North Koreans come. Tens of thousands. Who knows how many will come? They're already in Kursk. Fighting is going on. Ukraine is claiming that some North Koreans have been killed. And the North Koreans are using artillery against Ukraine. So this is a war now between Russia and North Korea on one side, Ukraine and NATO on the other.
Well, Dr. Suny, like you mentioned, we don't know how many more soldiers from North Korea to be dispatched to Russia, but what's your take on it? How many rounds of, deployment to Russia to come in the future, and, how often or until how long?
Here's the main thing. Right now, Russia is advancing. The Ukrainians are adding to their manpower. They're in a more powerful position. Ukrainians have realized, and the West has realized, and even NATO has realized, that if the war goes on, the Russians are going to triumph, and just more and more Ukrainians, as well as Russians and North Koreans, will be killed. So this is a war of attrition. And all sides now are interested in some kind of ceasefire. And that may come in the next months, I would think, in the first month or two after Trump gets into office. And Russia's biggest backer, remember, is China, and China has repeatedly called for the Russians to bring this war in Ukraine to an end.
Alrighty, Dr. Suny, thanks much for sharing your insight and your time with us this morning. You enjoy your evening there.
You too. 감사합니다.